So the first mechanic that I think that we wanted to start with was the Providence Scars, which is in the article that we wrote for our newsletter. The number one mechanic that we put there. This one's really cool. It's something that you don't really find in very many tabletop role playing games. In fact, the only game that I know of that does something that's even close to this is the One Ring by Free League Publishing. So Free League does a lot of games like Dragonbane and Alien RPG and The One Ring and things like that. So they have a lot of experience in making different types of games with a lot of flavor. But I find Free League to have a lot of influence from dark fantasy and horror. So when they make their games, they tend to add a few mechanics that have to do with that. And The One Ring is no exception. In The One Ring, The One Ring is based on J.R.R. Tolkien's work. So you have like the Lord of the Rings type of things, and there are treasures that are very rare. And when you find one of those treasures, specifically named treasures, they carry the weight of those who own them once. So, like, you see, if you haven't played that game, if you watch the movies for the Lord of the Rings, you know that a lot of the artifacts have names and have histories, and they carry a ton of weight, both emotional and story weight, as well as magical weight.
Yeah, it's like the artifacts in AD&D, D&D Second Edition. A lot of the artifacts were like that. They were named and they were unique, of course, being an artifact. But they carried a history with them. That's what made them really really different from just any weapon. And actually, even a weapon that's not something, you know, that is not something out of this world powerful, could be extremely interesting and valuable to the player, even if it's just like using D&D rules, a +1 longsword. If it has a really cool name and really cool history, that player will value it so much more than just a regular +1, or even say a +5 sword that doesn't have that kind of history.
hmm Yeah, initially D&D Fifth Edition. That was the intent, the design intent from Mike Mearls, and we've talked about it in our last video how Mike Mearls was kind of bringing old school to the new school with modern mechanics and stuff. But he definitely had a lot of influence from the old school when he made Fifth Edition as the lead designer. And one of the big design intents was for magic items to be kind of like that, which is why he made attunement slots. Everyone only has 3 attunement slots. So you can't have more than 3 attuned items or magic items on your character. And what he initially wanted was for, like, let's say you find a +1 sword, and you can see it in the early modules of 5th edition. When you find a +1 sword, it wasn't just a +1 sword. It was like this sword belonged to this one king, and he got buried with it, and all this stuff. And then it had that magical +1, trait to it. And even though it just dealt +1 damage and hit bonus, it still was cool because it had this history. But I think with dark fantasy, it has even more of an impact because a lot of these Providence Scars are very dark. Like, they have like a history specifically with how the person that owned the item was then either killed or defeated or whatever.